hello, and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 4 of The Magician's Nephew, The Hammer and the Bell.
Featuring Thor, I thought, but it turned out he didn't show up.
Had nothing to do with Thor. Well, today we are joined by Dr. Crystal Hurd. Dr. Hurd is an educator, a poet, and a researcher from Southwest Virginia. She holds a Master of Arts in Literature from East Tennessee State University, a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from the University of Texas at El Paso, and a Doctorate in Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis from East Tennessee State University. She just recently published the book, The Leadership of C.S. Lewis. And Crystal, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, we're excited to have you here. It's a long list of accomplishments there. A lot of things to be proud of, and the new book, which we just listeners have already heard our conversation and interview with you at this point. So we're excited to have you back to not talk about your book, although I'm sure some of the things will come back into play here, but to actually talk about a book by C.S. Lewis, and that is The Magician's Nephew.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I have a lot of student loans, so that's why. So.
Yeah. Oh, I love it.
I
don't love that. I love the joke.
No. But yeah, I love Narnia. This is a great book.
Before we jump into chapter 4, Phil has our summary here. But before we do that, when we last had you on the show for a chapter, it was for the very end of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. You mentioned at that time it was your favorite kind of part of all of the Chronicles. How do you feel about this book? Where does this book kind of land in any kind of, you don't have to rank all of them if you don't want to, but how do you feel about The Magician's Nephew?
I think it's really good. As you guys know, I mean, everybody in the Lewis Circle knows, unless you want to get vegetables thrown at you, that this is, the publishing order is actually different from the writing order. So this was a book that Lewis kind of went back and wrote to fill in, additionally from later. So to me, it kind of does feel like that. He's kind of going in and sort of filling in and expanding the story a little bit. I do like this book a lot though, because there is a tradition. I remember when I first read through them, I was like, gosh, he skips all these centuries in between some of these. And I remember The Horse and His Boy. It's like, wow, these are all new people except for, just a couple of them.
Sure.
And, but when you read them all together, it makes this really great chronology about sort of the wonder and power of Aslan over all these centuries in this land.
Yeah.
And so they all sort of play an integral part in their generation to do that. So it's really nice, I think, as someone who loves The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, obviously, to sort of see where the origin, it's like an origin story in the Marvel universe, right?
Right.
It's like, where did this come from, right? So it's really cool, I think, to sort of explore the origins of Professor Kirk, right? And see where Narnia began.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we just covered this in the last episode about a chapter where they just kind of drop it. They just kind of name drop the professor.
Yeah, Phil just found out that Diggory is the professor. He just learned that.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Well, Phil, why don't you go ahead and get us started with this summary? You've got it written over here. You've got 150 words or less to tell Crystal and myself and all of our listeners what happened in chapter 4.
All right. Diggory and Polly land in a strange place that is full of dull, red-tinted light and a deep blue sky. They walk through the high-walled courtyard, but don't see or hear anything save for the beating of their own hearts. After more exploring, they come upon golden doors left slightly ajar, and upon entering a large room, they find hundreds of waxwork people dressed in majestic clothing. Next to the people, they see a bell, and by magic they are able to understand the strange inscription on which it is placed. Driven by curiosity, and after a bit of a spat over whether or not they should just return to the forest, Diggory prevents Polly from leaving and rings the bell. A sweet but horrible note echoes along with an ominous crashing sound, and the children try to convince themselves that the worst of it is over.
Well done.
about halfway through, Daniel was giving me a look, and I thought, did I read the wrong chapter?
No. Yeah, I was invested. This is a great chapter.
It is.
This is one, Crystal,
Yeah.
you were excited to come on. Crystal, what about this chapter excites you before we get into the actual kind of, walking through it page by page?
Well, this is the defining chapter, like you said a minute ago. This is where all the trouble starts.
Oh, yeah.
This is where you up the plot in a fictional story. Like, this is where you introduce a new trouble, introduce a new problem. And like you said, this bell is going to echo through the rest of the stories from here on out.
And Lewis does write kind of with that foreshadowing where he's, Diggory felt sorry, and so did a lot of other people, and we kind of get this, and this is kind of this Edenic fall here that we have with Diggory and Polly, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about as we go through this chapter. But yeah, it is a good one. It's like you said, it's really the start of everything. It's a big one,
and it's all Diggory's fault.
It is all Diggory's fault. He comes across as like the worst character. He's yanking another girl's arm. He's yelling at her. He's making these like sexist comments at one point.
Oh yeah.
It's like this is a really bad chapter for Diggory.
Yeah.
Who hopefully we'll have to see, Phil. You don't know, but hopefully will be able to redeem himself a little bit.
Yeah, he has a bad case of FOMO, right? Fear of missing out.
Oh yeah.
That's really why he can't help himself.
Sure.
And whoever set that bell up was waiting for him in particular. He did not last very long with that challenge of not ringing the bell.
I will tell you, and I will say this for this whole chapter, to really get into a deep conversation here, we'll have to let Phil in on a little bit of what happens next, because we want to make sure we can have a good conversation while you're here, Crystal, and not just save it all for the next chapter. So I will say, Phil, that we will very soon find out who put that bell and hammer there, and that they meant for this to happen.
Okay,
well, so that's I will give you a little bit of that.
It reminded me a little bit of The Emperor's New Groove, where she hits that button and she gets trapped in something, and all these gators come out, and she goes, "Why do we even have that button?"
I don't remember any of this.
You should rewatch it.
I remember the movie being good. Yeah, I just don't remember that scene.
It's kind of it's an illusion of a choice, really.
Yes.
I mean, because I mean, you're going to hit the bell. I mean, you're going to walk away from the bell and just hang out with all the wax figures? No, you're going to ring the bell and see what happens.
That's right.
And then as Lewis says, well, it's all over anyway, says Diggory, and both thought it was, but they had never been more mistaken than their lives.
Yeah, that last line of the chapter.
So the way my book was set up, I was reading this one digitally, and sometimes there's a break only because they're going to show you a picture on the next page. Mm-hmm. But sometimes the break means the chapter's over. And I saw the break coming. I thought, are you seriously going to end right here after the bell rings? And then I read that last paragraph. I thought, yep, I'm going to have to wait another few weeks until.
You can imagine like all the little kids like from the 50s on being like, wait, Mom, you can't stop reading now. Like we have to read the next chapter. Yeah. Right?
So much for reading them to sleep.
Yes, yeah, you're not going to fall asleep after that one. Well, getting back here to the beginning of this chapter, Diggory and Polly, they jump through one of the pools. They have no idea what was happening. And Phil, actually, at the end of chapter 3, your prediction was they were going to jump into Narnia, which this clearly does not seem to be. We don't know for sure, but it certainly does not seem to be. No, do we get the name of the place in this chapter? I don't think it gets named, but I will go ahead and tell you just again so we can have this conversation. This is a place named Charn, Charn.
Okay.
So right off the bat here, there is, and I'm sure that most people reading this for the first time, if you're reading it in the order that God intended, which is the 6th in the series, you are expecting them to jump into Narnia. Like that would be the expectation.
At this point.
Exactly.
5 books in, every time they teleport anywhere,
they go into Narnia. Right. Yeah. Well, they've already had the weird teleportation where they didn't go to Narnia. They went to this wood between the worlds. So you would assume, okay, well, the next one has to be Narnia.
At this point, please.
And yet, it is not Narnia. They arrive at Charn, which is this kind of post-apocalyptic war zone in a way where there's nothing there. It's dead silence, and Lewis
there's no glass in the windows.
No glass.
No people, no sound.
And Lewis makes it very clear that while there's no sound in the wood between the worlds, that place is still full of life, even though it's silent. Whereas this is not full of any life. Like there is a complete absence of all light here. I mean, all life. Well, actually, light too, because we hear it's this like the sky looks dark, but it's this red,
and then a red glow,
kind of glow everywhere. In fact, really, the first half of this entire chapter, there's not a ton to break down because it's just atmospheric. It's just Lewis giving us this like interesting, description of this place. Phil, at any point did you think this was going to be Narnia? And this is maybe how Narnia started.
Yeah, so not knowing when we were going to be dropped in, and not knowing if there are more established rules about which place in the timeline you can drop in. I kind of thought maybe they're going to go ahead of everything.
Oh, like this is a future kind
These are ruins of yet another place,
Narnian
just like last
civilization.
time. That went away pretty quickly. I don't think that's going to happen. So then I thought, okay, maybe there were ruins before Cair Paravel was in ruins.
Yeah.
But apparently not. We're in Charn.
Charn, which is, I'm unclear. Maybe Crystal. It's always been unclear to me if Charn is the name of the city or the name of the world. Is there anything past just this one city? Is this the Coruscant of the Lewis world where the entire thing is? Because at one point they climb up and it says something along, or maybe that's next chapter, but at some point, they climb up and all they can see is city. All they can see is rubble and ruins of things. So it's unclear. Is this entire world, as Rick Ollier says, his famous line at the beginning of episode 1, the entire planet is one big city. That's what his action figure said. You remember in the episode 1, did you ever remember these action figures, Crystal, where you could put the comlink on?
Oh, no.
And they would talk. Yeah, they would. Phil knows what I'm talking about here. They would talk.
I still have one.
And Rick Ollier was the pilot of the ship, and he has one. And so they all would say like cool things, like "I'm going to defeat you, Darth Maul," or other things. And this guy would literally just say, "The entire planet is one big city," as if that was like the cool line of the movie. But that's not what we're here for.
Yeah.
Sorry, everybody.
No, you're good. I think we don't really see it after this. Yeah, we don't visit this city after.
Yeah, we don't get a lot.
Book, so I guess it's just maybe this would be a good Paul Ford question about the origins of it. But I mean, this is sort of where we meet. Well, can I tell him where we meet?
Yeah, Phil is already a little bit aware of who we're going to meet.
Yeah, okay. So we meet Jadis here, right? So that's like I said, and even Polly's like, I don't have a good feeling about this. And it's like, you should listen to her. Actually,
in fact, Polly's first 2 lines are something along the lines of, "I don't like it."
Yeah,
she says it first when they arrive, and Diggory says, "Yeah, it is kind of weird here." And then they go on. She's like, "No, I don't like this place." And this whole time, Polly is completely correct. She seems to know what's up here, and it's Diggory who's walking around the place, seemingly also feeling weird about it, but not enough so that he's ready to leave. In fact, he's like, well, they talk as they're moving along, we'll keep our rings in our pockets, so if we need to escape quickly, we can. But his later actions in this chapter, in my opinion, kind of prove that he's not saying that because he really believes it. It's more just to satisfy Polly so she'll stay with him.
Yeah, I think he's trying really hard to be a hero in this chapter, but his intuition's not up to par, And even Polly at the beginning of chapter 5, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit, like she even, she meets Jadis and she's like, I don't like her.
Yeah,
I don't like her. There's a vibe about this woman. I don't like her. Something's wrong, So I think that, I mean, and when they meet these, all these robed people, they're such a contrast, right, to the rest of the city, which is just ruin and rubble and destruction. So I think that's part of like why they're so, they're so infatuated with this idea of like, well, who is this? And we want to know this backstory, right? We would, and as readers, we want to know,
Well, of course, I think we're all happy that Diggory did this as readers. We don't have to live in this world, thankfully. So, but as you mentioned, Crystal, as they walk through this world, they do eventually arrive at, what Paul Ford calls the Hall of Images, where they walk in. There's these large, and Lewis is even points out they're taller than humans, which makes sense because we do know later that Jadis is taller than other humans because she's half Djinn, half giantess, right? And as they first walk in, it's Polly and Diggory both notice this interesting thing, which is that they're quick to recognize that they're looking at a line of monarchs, right? Mm-hmm. They're kind of dressed that way. They're seated that way. It's just very clear, kind of the essence they give off is one of royalty. And as they kind of walk down this line of wax-like figures, as Phil said in his summary, they actually start off looking quite like benevolent, right? Quite kind and generous, and then it kind of transitions to maybe just looking benign a little bit more, like they almost look they look happy themselves, but then we see that happiness transition. They still look happy, but they also look like they've been doing wrong things, and eventually those
more
evil,
severe.
Yes,
that's how it's described.
And eventually it gets to the point where the last woman they see, we don't know who that is yet. We'll have to find out. The last woman they see is the most beautiful woman Diggory ever saw, but Polly says she just looked average, and
a six if I round up, right?
And we see that she looks not only kind of evil, beautiful, but evil, but also that she kind of wears that kind of like stress, that weight of all of the decisions on her as well too. So we see this very clear line of things getting worse over who knows how long, if it was centuries, decades, or millennia. We have no idea. And I don't know that we'll ever find out.
This is definitely how I'm arranging every group photo from now on. The more severe people to the right. And friendly face. Yeah. Over here on the left.
Mean people over here. Yeah. I think it's so interesting too, because they see the dried up fountain right before they notice all those monarchs. And so like it really is this feeling that like there's no life here. Like there's no everything's dead. And I have often wondered if like he was talking about maybe how, as humans go, like we sort of get, is he saying we maybe get more corrupt sort of or things get corrupted as we go? And like, I thought that was really interesting.
There's a really great discussion to be had here, because is Lewis saying over time humanity has gotten worse? Lewis did just live through both world wars as he's writing this. He's now living during the Cold War in Europe, and you could make an argument that Lewis is saying humanity started okay and has gotten worse. Now, I'm going to say I actually don't think that's what he's saying, especially because the other very clear biblical allusion here is to the fall, right? So we have to think back, okay, this idea that, humanity used to be so great and we didn't do any of these things and now we're awful, it really doesn't line up with the biblical story at all. Humanity has been depraved since Genesis 3. Like that's,
yeah.
And so I wonder if instead what Lewis is, the picture he might be painting is the way that power corrupts here. That these monarchs start out much more benevolent, maybe using their power for good. They're happy. But eventually, and who knows? And again, we don't know how long it is. I don't think he's talking years here. He's talking decades, turning into centuries, maybe turning into a millennia here. That eventually, that kind of power, maybe not ultimately always has to, but at least often can corrupt people and turn them evil. I wonder if that's kind of his commentary on the state of the world during in the 1950s at this point, the middle of the 20th century, is not that, humans are just getting worse, but instead that humans are actually gaining more and more power, and that's the problem. And I don't want to have too big of a conversation about the deplorable word. There's a lot that people think Lewis might be saying about the state of things in the 20th century with that, but Phil's looking at me having not heard of what I'm even saying. He doesn't know the word, which is good, because he could do a lot of damage if he did.
Yeah. It's like he who shall not be named, right? In Harry Potter.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think you're right on that, because and we've talked about this in leadership circles. Early leaders were usually like people who were captains of armies, and it was usually people who were out on battlefields fighting. And look at our own country, right? I mean, George Washington he was wearing a uniform fighting for our country, and so he had experience on the battlefield, and so in a lot of ways, and this isn't, I'm speaking just sort of Western civilization, really. I know there's been monarchies that for centuries in other places, but I think there's a great lesson to be learned about how monarchies can become corrupt, right? The longer and longer that they exist, because those people feel like they're untouchable.
Sure.
And they can, there's too much control there and not enough checks, right? Which is what in America we tried to get away from, and,
Yes.
and create, which we all, it's just interesting to me. That was one of the arguments against monarchy, and that's one of the founding principles of our country, was to, switch those leaders out so they don't get comfortable, and get corrupt there.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, Crystal. I thought I had read somewhere that Lewis was actually a relatively big fan of the English monarchy. That he was, am I just making this up? I don't want to say it if it's not true. I feel like I'd read somewhere that he was like, he kind of liked all the ceremony of it all.
Yeah, it's sorry to bring up the parents again, but it's important to know.
No, this is why we have you on the show.
In Belfast, there was back when Lewis was a boy, there was something called Home Rule, and it was a really big, argument that they had. I mean, there was of course Catholic Protestant arguments that were super prevalent there, but one of the big ones was Home Rule, and it was, should we become independent, or should we remain under England's wing, essentially?
Sure.
And C.S. Lewis's father was a proponent of Home Rule. He felt that Britain, there in his speeches as a young man, or make it very clear that he feels like the king is an important to part of this aristocracy, and not that obviously that corrupt people, but he did feel that being independent would have its own issues. So he actually argued that they should stay apart, which they are still right to this day, a part of the British Empire, essentially.
He argued for Northern Ireland to stay a part of the United Kingdom,
right,
and not join the rest of Ireland.
Right. He felt that independence would have its own issues.
Sure.
And just like Lewis says, right, humans aren't really equipped to rule a hen roost, much less rule each other, because we are fallen creatures and we're corrupt, and we can, we have the capacities to hurt one another, just like we have the capacities to help one another. So I think he respected Churchill. He did respect the Queen. I don't think he was ever outwardly critical of the monarchy, as far as I know. He did say in some letters, yeah, all governments have problems. But I don't think as far as I know, I don't think he's ever been super openly critical of the monarchy.
And I mean, he often stayed away from those kind of conversations publicly anyway.
Absolutely.
So it is hard to kind of know.
A lot of people want to sort of brand him a conservative. And of course, the word conservative means different things than it does A, in America, and B, right now, than it did back then. But, he was very much a big fan of like small government. Right. And he talks about this in his speech at Cambridge, right? His inaugural speech at Cambridge, just let people live their lives. Don't intrude, right? He says a government's job is just to keep everything on an even keel so people can live their lives and eat their dinners and have their children and go to their soccer games and do this, let them live their lives.
I think he said football games, but yeah.
Well, yeah.
No, keep going. Sorry, Crystal.
No, but that was his sentiment. His sentiment was that the government does not interfere with daily life. What he complained about, and I think it's still true, is that now everybody's obsessed with the government and obsessed with politicians, and so it's become daily life to be super involved in political debates and all that stuff. And he felt that really just detracted from living your normal life.
He from what I understand, Crystal, he viewed the idea of politics and government as, and I mean, I can't fathom this living in America in 2022. Like, he kind of looked at like political conversations and kind of not maybe like political ideology and talking about ideas of politics or philosophy, but talking about your current thoughts on this elected official or that elected official and what they did or didn't do, that was not kind of the way that regular people talk. Like, that shouldn't be a part of your daily life. Whereas, for all of us now, it does, unfortunately feel like, we're all kind of guilty making it, and for, maybe there's good reason for that, right? We're not going to get into all that here, but he very much, and reading some of the letters that I've read, which I've obviously read a lot less letters than you have, I always get the sense that he's like, oh, that's like it does feel more like a third rail for him. Like he's not going to be the person to bring up politics at a party,
right,
or even with his close friends, not because he's afraid of talking about it, but just because we're having a good time. Why would we do that?
Yeah, exactly. Don't don't pepper the pot, right? With
exactly,
with all this stuff. And he was I think he was very he had his perspective on things, but he just felt like if you're in an environment where it will cause nothing but division and argument, why waste your time? Why not? Let's talk about, that's the whole point of mere Christianity, right? It's about bringing people together under a common banner of beliefs that had, a faith that had been splintered and with, old ideas and world wars and everything. And his whole, goal with mere Christianity was to bring people together and to try to unify them. Under that banner. And so I think he felt enough with the divisiveness. Like, let's pull in the opposite direction. Let's pull toward each other. Let's try to find something in common, but he still, I think in chapters like this, I think he still subtly sort of gives his ideas about like what he thinks about those things. And, you probably noticed it's not like, Narnia has like Prince Caspian or King Caspian or, but they're all incredibly benevolent, kind people, and they don't micromanage, and they don't ride out to like Mr. Tumnus's house and is like, where have you paid your taxes today? They're not.
Hopefully we get that Netflix show. the comedy workplace of like the Narnian tax department, and it's like they're really incompetent, but that's the funny joke.
And then 3 years later, the Mogram spinoff and
Do you think, Crystal, that a lot of that idea of wanting to move away from divisive things to things that unify, do you think that comes from growing up in Belfast? It's hard to think of another more divisive place in Western Europe than Ireland, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the climate was conflict there. You probably
middle of the 20th century.
You probably read the story about Alistair McGrath was talking about one of his nurses, like when he would go number 2, like his nurses called him little popes instead of little poops or something like that when he would go number 2 as a kid.
Did not hear about that. No,
that's in Alistair McGrath's biography. But honestly, like most of the people.
Wait, so Lewis was the one who said that, or like one of his?
McGrath said that one of Lewis's nurses
did that.
Called them little popes. Okay. Yeah, they called them little popes instead of little poops or something like that. I double checked me on it. It's been a few years since I read it, but wow. You live in a climate where you can't say anything about the opposite. He grew up embittered in that, and not only that, but his father was like a leading politician in that era. So he was that was his daily life, was having to settle situations where all of this fuming and fighting was bleeding over into everyday transactions and things between people. So I think somebody who grew up and saw that, and then we see his imagination is a place that he ran to escape all that stuff. So I think when it to me, it makes perfect sense where he created a world, not just Animal Land, right? But he created a world where people are like, hey, let's all just get together, and then later on we'll get rid of the bad guy, and then it'll be cool again, and we'll restore everything. Let's restore everything.
That's really interesting. And thinking of it too, just I get the sense that his creating a monarchy in Narnia had probably very little to do with his own ideas of government, and instead had much more to do with the literature he's pulling from.
Right. Traditional storytelling.
Exactly.
As I say, King Arthur and all that stuff.
Exactly, the Arthurian stuff.
He loved that romantic idea. Yeah.
Absolutely.
The idea of a prime minister was a little more fresh at the time.
Well, let's go ahead and go back into the Hall of Images here. So Diggory and Polly, they see this woman here at the end. There's empty chairs after that that look like they probably would have been filled, but they are not. And then they go see in the middle of the the room is that hammer and the bell. And this really cool thing, very Star Trekian thing happens here with like the universal translator, where they go and I love this part. Actually, do y'all mind if I read this paragraph real quick?
Let's hear it.
Good.
So they go up to this, and they can't quite read what it says. You're thinking, of course, I mean, like this, they're not going to write in English here. That doesn't make sense. But here's what Lewis writes. They both looked at it hard, and as you might have expected, the letters cut in the stone were strange. But now a great wonder happened. For, as they looked, though the shape of the strange letters never altered, they found that they could understand them. If only Diggory had remembered what he himself had said a few minutes ago, that this was an enchanted room, he might have guessed that the enchantment was beginning to work. But he was too wild with curiosity to think about that. He was longing more and more to know what was written on the pillar. And very soon, they both knew. And Phil, what is written on that pillar?
Actually, this is one of the few things I highlighted in
Okay,
this chapter.
cool. I'm glad I called on you
really
for it.
enjoyed how this is written. Make your choice, adventurous stranger. Strike the bell and bide the danger, or wonder till it drives you mad what would have followed if you had. Not only did it translate into English so that they could understand it, they translated it into verse.
Yes.
Yep.
Which is not easy to do when you translate. Like a lot of times when we
Right.
take, a lot of, I think of Dante being one of the ones where like all of his rhyming in Italian usually doesn't make it into
Right.
English because we can't so how great, what cool magic they have. Like I know like a lot of times if you read Shakespeare in like French, the iambic pentameter doesn't make it over. So what wonderful magic they have here to keep the verse in there as well. Well, Diggory here, all of this happens. Polly says, no, we're not going to do that. Of course, that's ridiculous. This is clearly a trap. This is not a good idea. And Diggory going back and forth with her says a lot, has some ugly words to share. In fact, she even says, as he's telling her, I think it's when he says, well, you're a girl. All you really are curious about is gossip. She's like, hey, you look like you're a girl, Andrew, when you say that. So we're getting this idea that this is not supposed, like, there's no subjective way to read this. It is objectively Diggory in the wrong here. At least that's how Lewis is writing this. And in fact, Diggory goes on to make it even worse, where he grabs and hurts Polly so that she can't take her arm out. And with the other hand, he grabs the hammer and he rings this bell. Now, before we go on to what happens next, we've already, Crystal, you and I have already let Phil a little bit in on this secret of some bad things happen, and it's not going to be good. The question I have for us to think through is, if this is supposed to be a fall, some kind of Edenic fall, looking at Adam and Eve being maybe Diggory and Polly here as a supposal, obviously, is Lewis's idea here that curiosity is bad? Because it seems like, now Diggory, what he does to Polly by holding her, yelling mean names at her, that's not okay. But simply ringing the bell in and of itself doesn't seem like a bad thing. Like you mentioned, Crystal, is it just fear of missing out? Is that all it is? He's just a curious guy. Aren't we supposed to be curious about God's creation? What's happening here?
Well, I don't think he's being down on curiosity. I think he's just, I think it states explicitly, right? Bide the danger. If you ring the bell, like it says there, it's dangerous if you ring it, right? And she's like, oh, she even says, oh, danger. No, I don't want any of that, right? And then was like, well, why not? Then you're just going to always bloody wonder if you were, what has happened, right? And I think it's interesting that he grabs her hand in that image and he rings the bell with the other one, so it almost appears like they're both doing it.
Yeah,
what I mean? Like he's connected to her and then rings it because all of humanity is going to be impacted by the echo of this bell, through the rest of the books. So I think it's interesting. It's almost like he doesn't want to take full responsibility for it, so he grabs her hand and then rings it.
Hey, you did it with me.
Yeah. But really, it was because she said, I'm leaving, and he didn't want her to leave. She's like, I can't be a part of this. I'm peace out. I'm bouncing or whatever. And then he's like, no, I can't be alone. I can't do this alone. So then he sort of grabs her and does that. But I think he was warned. Right. I mean, think back. You were mentioning, Eden a little bit ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
In Eden, right? They're warned. You can eat of any tree but this one tree, and the knowledge that knowledge is what is sinful, right? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Well, by ringing that bell, he is gaining that knowledge, right? So it parallels to me. It parallels it parallels Adam and Eve in the fall, because he can't stand it. He has to find out what it is, and he doesn't do it alone. He does it with her, but he's been warned not to do it, and he still does it anyway. So I don't think that's curiosity. I think that's just being, what do you call it? I guess it's just being foolhardy.
Sure.
Yeah, to me, what stands out is the consequence.
Right.
The inscription, to me, it seems inevitable that they're going to ring the bell.
Right.
And maybe they would have talked about it a little bit more. Maybe he would have convinced her. Who knows? But it's inevitable that the bell is going to be rung.
Right.
And that there are going to be consequences from that.
Right.
And I've heard of examples of the tree being presented to Adam and Eve as this is the one thing you can't do. Why even put it in there?
Right.
Well, God gives us a choice.
Right.
And I think it's an example of like, here is this choice, and you don't have to do this, but if you do it, there are consequences, and we're trying to warn you from that.
Right.
And it's not like it's not like that's the one thing that happened. We all do that.
Right.
It's inevitable that we cannot be perfect, and that we keep choosing the wrong thing.
Right.
That's well said too. Yeah, I take a little bit more of the side that I actually do think Lewis is saying something about curiosity here. I don't think, I agree with you, Crystal, I don't think he's saying curiosity is bad in and of itself. I do think that Diggory here, this is not some kind of humble curiosity of wonder, This is much more prideful curiosity of greed and power. It's just, I deserve or I need this knowledge, as opposed to I want to learn this knowledge. Right? And I think actually that St. Thomas Aquinas has quite a bit to say about this idea of curiosity, and a couple of other Lewis scholars, as I was doing a little bit of reading, have made this a similar connection. I actually found Joseph Pierce's further up and further in. I thought his was probably the most comprehensive. But going to some of what St. Thomas Aquinas writes in one of his books on that huge work he did on theology, my Latin is not great. I believe it's called Summa
Theologica.
Exactly. Thank you. You got it for me. I actually pulled up a couple of quotes from him. Oops, excuse me. I hit the microphone there. But I wanted to read them. He actually asked the question, can the vice of curiosity regard intellective knowledge? And these are the two little snippets I wanted to pull, because I actually think they give us some good ideas. Again, it's not always the easiest to digest, but I do think it's really thought-provoking. This is what St. Thomas writes. He says, "Now we must judge differently of the knowledge itself of truth and of the desire and study in the pursuit of the knowledge of truth. For the knowledge of truth, strictly speaking, is good, but it may be evil accidentally by reason of some result, either because one takes pride in knowing the truth, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 8, which says, knowledge puffeth up, or because one uses the knowledge of truth in order to sin." And then he goes on, he has this quick thing to say. He says, when a man desires to know the knowledge about creatures without referring to his knowledge to its due end, namely the knowledge of God. Hence, Augustine, speaking of St. Augustine, says, this is actually now Augustine speaking, this is St. Thomas quoting St. Augustine, so it must be good, right? He says, St. Augustine says, in studying creatures, we must not be moved by empty and perishable curiosity. Interesting phrase there, perishable curiosity. But we should ever mount towards immortal and abiding things. So as I hear those things, I think that's all to say that Diggory, and honestly Uncle Andrew in the last few chapters, their curiosity is sinful.
Yeah.
Not because the idea of curiosity is bad, but it's not the act of being curious, but it's because of why they are curious. And that is, I think, what St. Thomas and St. Augustine are saying here, that people like Joseph Pierce, I think David Downing might have I think it was him too, it might have been someone else, were kind of pointing out, is that it's the why behind Diggory's curiosity. It's not that he just wants to know, it's that he wants to have the knowledge.
Right. Because look at Uncle Andrew, like, right, when in those earlier chapters, when he's like, why do you have all these rings? And what do you, and Uncle Andrew's like, well, I'm just different. Right. Yeah. Ours is a high and lonely destiny.
Exactly.
He's just, it's like, oh my gosh, like that, my arrogance meter is like, is it over? You're beeping. It's beeping. Like, you are so arrogant. You think you're better than everybody.
And the thing pride. Is, yeah, and he is an intelligent guy, or at least he's presented that way at the beginning, I'll say. And obviously he still doesn't know a lot about how the rings work, but the mere fact is he knows a little bit about them. He does have some kind of knowledge, but even that knowledge he wields inappropriately, and that's a big part of why he's bad. He's not bad because he's curious about other worlds. He's bad because he wants to know about other worlds so he can use it to abuse others. Like, that's the bad part.
To make himself, to puff up. To make himself,
exactly, just from 1 Corinthians there. I think it kind of all falls down into kind of with great power comes great responsibility, right? I mean that's
and pride comes before a fall, which is
exactly yes, or before a hammer. So to get back to the very end of this chapter, on the last page, Diggory rings the bell, and the loudest sound ever rings. I think actually my son does this regularly. Whenever he doesn't get the right color crown, he's actually mimicking Narnia by screaming at the absolute top of his lungs. So I can relate to Diggory and Polly here. The sound is incredibly loud, right, as it comes out to the point where they can't even hear each other, and then a part of the roof caves in.
Yeah.
And then that's the end of the chapter.
Right. It's not exactly it's a cliffhanger, but what an interesting place to end. Yeah. Everything's collapsing, and then it's just...
Which is a great metaphor for everything that's getting ready to happen.
The roof is literally caving in.
Yeah. And the note is beautiful, but horrendous at the same time, which is a really interesting description.
Yeah. Well, any final thoughts from y'all before we wrap up chapter 4 here?
I think we covered it.
Yeah, I think it's a great chapter. I mean, like I said, as an origin story, I think it's really well done. Actually, I think he tries to not make it feel like a sequel, or prequel or whatever. Right. But I think it's great. I mean, I think it gives us a great backstory, and it spans Narnia's boundaries in our imagination a lot more.
We've also set up more than just the bell's been rung, and now something's going to happen. We've shown, and he alluded to it a little bit before, and we saw glimpses of it, but we saw a really nasty argument between the two of them. Yeah. And that nasty argument happened directly before this big event. So I imagine that if the event gets resolved, maybe their relationship will...
Yeah, there's been no reconciliation yet. Right. I mean, they still don't like each other.
Yeah, now they have a problem that's going to take their mind off the relationship issue. Right. For a little bit.
Right. Well, that's what he says right in the chapter. Like, now they have bigger problems.
Yeah, they've got a much worse thing coming their way than just their friendship.
Or maybe it's nothing.
Yeah, we don't know. You don't know. It could be nothing. Yeah,
we could stop right here.
Just a really loud bell, and it's later that things get worse.
We don't have to turn the page.
I really do love Polly in the last battle, though. I think she's so great. So, and now as a character, it's like you look at this book, and then when you read the last battle, it's like, look at all the character development she's had.
Yeah, she does go through quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to think about here when it comes to these two characters. It's a really big moment, and it's actually outside of Edmund, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I don't know that we've had one of our human characters kind of sink this low before. I mean, I guess you could argue Eustace, but he was presented as kind of a jerk from the very beginning. Like, Diggory wasn't. Diggory was presented as kind of a kid that we could look up to a little bit as readers, especially as young readers. And it's here that you really see him do some pretty terrible things, and that hasn't really happened, honestly, even with Edmund. Like Edmund and Eustace at the beginning of both of their novels are presented as mean kids. Like Edmund's mean in chapter 1 of Wardrobe, Eustace is mean in chapter 1 of Dawn Treader. No one's reading those going, oh, I see myself in these kids. Well, hopefully they don't see themselves in them, right? I would portray my family too. But Diggory has been this, mostly fun character. In fact, he's done some really brave things. In chapter 2, he sticks up for Polly to Andrew and even goes after her, risking his own life. And so there's been some heroic qualities. Absolutely. And so I think this is a pretty significant fall for a character who so far has been a really good character.
Right, or at least presented himself as a good character. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that about wraps up our time together. This is exciting because that means that next chapter, Phil, you and I get to talk about chapter 5, which is called The Deplorable Word. It might be one of my favorite chapters in all of the Chronicles. Probably my favorite of this whole book.
Wow.
Really excited for this one. A lot of things to talk about there, because in that chapter, the queen is awakened. That's all I'll say.
I wonder if she's behind a giant block of ice.
Yes, that's exactly right. She's going to be, it's actually in carbonite, and so she's going to be slowly unfrozen and kind of fall towards the floor.
She's from hibernation.
She can't
sickness.
see. Yeah, she can't see for a while until they get out onto the plains of Carcoon or whatever the place is called. But yeah, so we'll be back with chapter 5 next time. Crystal, as always, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is always so much fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoyed our conversation last episode and this episode.
Yeah.
I'm really glad you could make it.
Thank you so much for having me here. I appreciate it.
Well, Phil, do you want to wrap us up here?
I'll take it from here.
Just take a picture, because now I got to edit that. Phil's not ready. I mean, I'm not ready.
I'm not ready because you didn't hand it to me.
It should be this yellow.
This episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you too can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to Hannah Anderson, John Marr, Emily Wakefield, and Ryan Smith for supporting us at our top tiers. If you have any listener feedback, send it along to thenarniapodcast@gmail.com, or if you want to leave a voicemail at 406-646-6733. A review on Apple Podcasts would also be appreciated. Thank you for coming along on this journey, and we will be back next time with Chapter 4.